Oki sinitapi, nisto iniskimaki, nisto emskapi pikani, how madakapi shutanga lakota tetwino yate. So my heart is happy to be here. Greetings to you all. I am a citizen of the Blackfeet Nation of Montana, and we are part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The other of three of our tribes reside in Alberta, Canada. I'm also born and raised in Rosebud, South Dakota, and that's where I grew up. So welcome everyone. And so as I do have the honor today of introducing our plenary, Dr. Sarah Kostelic, who is Alutiiq. She's an enrolled citizen of the native village of Ozinki, and she is the executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association. I know Sarah going back many years. She was actually one of my professors when I went back to grad school in St. Louis. And she's been involved in so much work that I'm familiar with, but I've maybe let her share some of that information with you. So I'm honored to welcome today Dr. Sarah Kostelic.
Wonderful. Thank you, Willeen. Quiana. Well, Chamai, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here with you. I thank the Creator for bringing us all here safely together, and I'd like to thank our conference organizers for all of their planning and preparation to ensure this intentional learning environment for all of us. I appreciate the invitation to share my experience and also to learn from you. And I appreciate the sacrifices that you've all made to be away from your family for the few days, to travel here, and to give your time and attention to these few days of learning together. You know, there's a lot of competition for the way that you spend your time, and our time is one of the most valuable things we have. And so what we choose to give our time to matters. It shows what we value. So thank you for being here. And finally, I'd like to honor my parents and my teachers for giving me the shoulders to stand on and weaving the path of opportunity that brought me here to this day. So this afternoon, I'm going to speak for about an hour, and then we have 20 to 30 minutes for question and answer at the end. Partway through, I'm going to show a slide to share an image with you. Also, about 2/3 of the way through, I have a short video clip. It's a longer video, but we're going to watch a few minutes of it to help illustrate a point I'm trying to make today. So as Willeen said, I'm Alutiiq. That's my cultural and linguistic group. I'm a citizen of the native village of Ozinki, which is near Kodiak, Alaska, at the top of the Aleutian chain. It's a community of about 250 people. So during our welcome exercise this morning, I was trying to suss out if there are any Alaskans here. Is there anybody here from Alaska? Yeah, I didn't think so. I checked our registration list and it didn't look like it, but I wanted to just make sure. So in a room with so many educators, I wanted to make sure you knew this fun fact. You probably don't know this, but actually we all carry a map of the state of Alaska with us wherever we go, right? So on your hand, you have a map of the state of Alaska. So the Aleutian chain is here, and Kodiak is at the top of the Aleutian chain. It's about 400 miles south of Anchorage, and that's where my family is from. Even within the state of Alaska, when people meet each other for the first time, it's very common that people show each other where they're from on their hand map. So wanted to make sure that you knew them. So again, Chamai, we, Sarah Kostelic, Washington, D.C., Misuriana, Mamaka, Dorothy Hicks, Tharaka, Scott Hicks. That's the beginning of my introduction in my native Alutiiq language. I'm an Alutiiq second language learner. So Alutiiq wasn't my first language, but I'm learning it now. In English, the translation is, hello, my name is Sarah Kostelic. I was born in Washington, D.C. My mother is Dorothy Hicks. My father is Scott Hicks. And I could go on to say my maternal grandparents are the late Horace and Georgia Odell from Murphy, North Carolina. My paternal grandparents are the late Glafira Lukeen from Afognak, Alaska, and Gwen Hicks from Greensboro, North Carolina. And I could continue to go back generation after generation. I could also name all of my siblings, their spouses, my nieces and nephews. In Western culture, what's important in an introduction is your name, what you do and your credentials, and where you live. In contrast, in Indigenous cultures, what's valued in an introduction is who your family is and where they're from. And that's because this illustrates who you are through layers of connectedness to other people and places. At their core, Indigenous cultures are relational. We see the world through patterns of relationships. From an Indigenous perspective, we members of the human community need each other. We're bound together, we're interdependent. No one is dispensable. We need the gifts and talents of each one in order to build and maintain the society we live in. Dr. Shelley Spiller, an Indigenous Maori woman from New Zealand, says this tracing of genealogies is much more nuanced and complex than a recital of family trees. It's a way of ordering the world, and it connects humans to every other aspect of creation. Indigenous worldviews and tribal values offer a unique understanding of purpose, connectedness, belonging, and ultimately of well-being. Dr. Spiller says in Maori culture, people are a reflection of each other, such that in serving others, one is serving one's extended self and helping to serve a shared purpose. Similarly, from the time I was small, my Alutiiq father told me, when you need help, help other people, and in doing so, you'll always find the help that you need. This advice has served me well, and I think it's what led me to a career in social work. In this understanding of reciprocity, we become nourished through nourishing others. When we proverbially feed others, we get fed. I was also taught to prepare for public speaking through prayer, to be an instrument that the Creator needs to express his message, and to preemptively apologize if anything I say offends you. I offer for your consideration what I've been moved to share with you, and it's my hope that it will give you something to take away, something to think about or to act on. But if I say anything that offends you, it's my imperfect delivery. And I hope that you'll let me know so that I have the opportunity to make things right between us. I want to be in a good relationship with you and to help you do the important work that you're doing here. In a Western self-introduction, I would have gone on to say that I serve as the executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, or NICWA as we call it. We support the safety, health, and spiritual strength of American Indian and Alaska Native children and youth, and we work to eliminate child abuse and neglect by strengthening Native families, tribes, and the laws that protect them. We build the capacity of tribal nations, tribal governments, 574 in the United States, to prevent child maltreatment. We also serve the more than 600 First Nations in Canada. I was taught that to lead is a privilege and a sacrifice. In many Native communities, certain leadership responsibilities are bestowed with an apology. The preemptive apology is a recognition of the burden of responsibility and what it will require of the beneficiary. For me, the acceptance of leadership responsibility is an opportunity to balance urgency with patience and to couple strategy with passion in stewarding NICWA, a culturally based organization that strives to strengthen the well-being of children and families. Like many leaders, my family was affected by the helping systems that I'm working to change today, and that lived experience keeps me leading from the center. Chief Sitting Bull said, "Let us put our minds together and see what we can make for our children." This afternoon, I'm going to share with you some of our thoughts at NICWA about the intertwined nature of the well-being of Native children, families, and communities. How key strategies for the well-being of Native people and the land, incidentally, are encoded in traditional Native cultures, and what we can all do today to strengthen the well-being of so many Native children throughout our country. So I'll start this afternoon with what it means to be healthy and well, and a little bit about how our organization, NCWA, does our work. The well-being of children is inextricably linked to their family and community. At NCWA, we look at the well-being of Native children using what we call the relational worldview, which allows us to account for the context of individuals as well as the mind, body, and spirit. And balance between these four quadrants promotes optimal health and well-being. NCWA provides what we call community development technical assistance to enhance the level and quality of services delivered to Native children and families by their tribes or urban Indian organizations or other service providers. Our job is to act as a catalyst for self-determined positive change, to be an ally in healing and vision building, to be a resource for technical know-how, a broker of resources, and a partner in quality improvement. NCWA's approach includes facilitating change, conducting needs assessments, mapping resources, designing funding strategies, providing how-to consultation, conducting training, and evaluating progress. A self-determined vision, clearly articulated local values, and community-based goals form the foundation of change. NCWA assists tribal leaders and stakeholders with community visioning, values clarification, and goals setting. Based on this core work, NCWA helps to build infrastructure, including a practice model, policies and procedures, interagency agreements, tribal codes and ordinances, child protection teams, and licensing standards. NCWA deals with a range of content areas, including prevention, family support, parent education, in-home services, child protection, substitute care, permanency planning, including customary tribal adoptions, and children's mental health. We use the term community in a loose but inclusive way to describe a tribe, reservation or tribal land, geographic division of a reservation, or the Native population of an urban area. Wherever Native people govern themselves as sovereigns or choose to gather and act jointly for the common well-being, a community exists. Communities act jointly for the common good through the institutions of government or through private nonprofit organizations. NCWA approaches community development as a process that has many components or steps, and we use these components as a method of helping communities. Our approach includes public awareness and education, vision, values, and goal facilitation, fostering and facilitating community-based change through stakeholder engagement. So partnering with the community, engaging the community, strategic planning, assessment of situations, needs, and resources, linking communities with resources, leadership development, consultation, coaching and assistance, training, and program evaluation. So our approach is based on the idea that everyone in tribal and urban Native communities should become aware of adverse childhood experiences, the problems that contribute to them, such as substance abuse and domestic violence, and their consequences, such as chronic health problems, mental health problems, and more violence. Intergenerational trauma is the mechanism through which adverse childhood experiences are transmitted to succeeding generations. Based on public education and awareness, we believe that every Native community has within it individuals who are committed to the well-being of children and families. These individuals may be grassroots community members, service providers, natural helpers or healers, or community leaders that advocate on behalf of children. NCWA joins with these individuals and groups to foster and facilitate community-based change. Our philosophy is that no solution developed and imposed from outside the community can ever effectively deal with the social and economic problems brought about by colonization, which I'll talk more about later. Solutions have to be locally developed and owned and must include community-based healing. We believe that anyone in a Native community who wants to improve the lives of Native children and families should be empowered to do so. To be empowered means to be informed, to know what can be done about a problem, to have a vision for how it can be different, and to have access to the resources to bring about change. Sometimes individual healing is a part of being empowered. NICWA conducts vision-building exercises with community leaders, provides information on existing models, assesses resources that may be tapped, and facilitates healing through discussion and connecting child advocates with self-care and spiritual resources. To implement the needed changes, empowered child advocates and leaders need institutional infrastructure. So we help tribes and organizations to develop this infrastructure with hands-on consultation, providing examples, connecting developing programs with experienced ones for peer support, supporting interagency and intergovernmental negotiations, reviewing policies, proposals or standards, and providing feedback and management coaching. Programs that are up and running need skilled staff informed on the best way to do the tasks associated with the job of protecting children and preserving families. Advocates need information on how to prevent abuse. Program managers need to be skilled in decision-making and program operations. They need to be informed about the array of challenges and specific problems, such as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, domestic violence, substance abuse, severe emotional disturbances, and physical and sexual abuse. All of the program staff need to know about various approaches to preventing abuse and protecting children, preserving families, providing protective services, kinship care, foster care, and permanency planning. As communities implement program responses to address the needs of children and families, they need ongoing access to resources to maintain effective intergovernmental relationships and to measure the effectiveness of their efforts through evaluation. We regularly participate in meetings between tribal and state officials, disseminate information on funding sources, and conduct program evaluations. So that's what our work looks like. We empower communities, and because of the incredible diversity in Indian country, this work looks different everywhere we go. So let's talk for a minute about diversity. In the US, there are 574 sovereign tribal nations that are variously called tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, rancherias, communities, and native villages. And they're in 35 states, and each of these tribes has a nation-to-nation relationship with the US government. Additionally, there are 11 states that have more than 63 state-recognized tribes. There are also an additional 100 plus tribes that are seeking federal recognition through a really complex administrative process within the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the US Department of the Interior. Tribes vary greatly in terms of their traditions and cultural beliefs, like the difference between nomadic and more sedentary lifestyles, in their social organization, things like gender roles, intergenerational relationships, relationships between community members, in their spirituality and religion, in their language. They differ in their geography, their natural resource endowments, their choices about the degree and type of development activities that they pursue. Tribes differ in terms of their organization of government, the branches of government, how they resolve disputes, whether they have written or oral constitutions. Tribes also differ in their experience with the US government, including relocation, degree of assimilation, land base, and population on reservation or tribal land. And several tribes have no land base at all. Tribes also differ in terms of their intergovernmental relationship. their relationships with state and local governments, as well as their choice to administer different kinds of tribal programs, things like schools, hospitals, law enforcement, social services, or whether they choose to receive some of those services from the state. So there are many dimensions of tribal diversity that mean that tribal communities and populations have different philosophies, different strengths, and different needs, and as such may take different approaches to advancing their self-determination and to nurturing their citizen families. As I said, we conceptualize the well-being of children according to the relational worldview, which NICWA founder Terry Cross developed in the 1980s. The relational worldview, which is sometimes called the cyclical worldview, finds its roots in Native cultures and is a composite of many related tribal teachings. It's a non-time-oriented, intuitive, and fluid framework. In this framework, balance and harmony in relationships are the driving principles, along with the interplay of spiritual forces. Every event is in relation to all other events, regardless of time, space, or physical existence. Health exists only when things are in balance or harmony. In the relational worldview, helpers or healers are taught to understand problems through balances and imbalances in a person's relational world. We're taught to see and accept complex interrelationships that can be influenced by helping the person to alter their balance contextually, cognitively, emotionally, physically, and/or spiritually. So interventions don't need to be targeted to a specific symptom or root cause, but are rather focused on bringing the person back into balance. And this is possible because nothing in a person's existence can change without other things being affected and changed. So we can think about this as the notion of the ripple effect, or change influencing other changes, has a cascading effect. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, so I'm going to pull up this slide here so that you can see what I'm talking about. So the relational worldview has historically been applied at the individual level to individual well-being, but we also apply it to the family level, and in a different model that I'm not going to show you today, we can also apply this same kind of framework at the community level or at the organizational level. So in this framework, balance between mind, body, spirit, and context is what produces health and well-being. And this kind of framework, as I mentioned, is a composite of many different traditional teachings. And so sometimes it's associated with things like the medicine wheel or sacred hoop or four directions teachings of various different tribes. These four quadrants represent the major forces or sets of factors that together have to come into balance. In the mind quadrant, you can see our cognitive processes, things like thoughts and memories, knowledge. And you can also see the emotional processes, things like feelings and defenses and self-esteem. The body quadrant includes all of the physical aspects, such as genetic inheritance, gender and condition, as well as sleep and nutrition and substance use. The spiritual quadrant includes both positive and negative, learned teachings and practices, as well as positive and negative metaphysical or innate forces. The context quadrant includes culture, community, family, peers, work, school, and social history. So these four quadrants are in constant flux and change. So we say an individual isn't the same person at 4 o'clock in the afternoon that they are at 7 o'clock in the morning. Our level of sleep is different, our nutrition is different, and our context is likely different. So our behavior is different, our feelings are different, what we're thinking about is different, right? After lunch, we're not feeling the same way we were when we walked into the room first thing this morning. So this system is constantly balancing and rebalancing itself as we change thoughts, feelings, our physical state, or our spiritual state. If we're able to stay in balance, we're said to be healthy, well, and thriving. In fact, even if some aspects of the quadrant are weak, strengths in other aspects may balance out the system. and create a synergy that's associated with health. So there's some compensation that can be involved here. But sometimes the balance is temporarily lost. So there's an elder in my community who calls this getting wobbly. As human beings, we have the capacity to keep our own balance for the most part. And we often don't even realize that we're making adjustments all the time to maintain our equilibrium. Our different cultures provide many mechanisms to assist us in this process. Spiritual teachings, social norms and skills, dietary rules, family norms. These are all among the myriad ways that we culturally maintain our balance. And when we get wobbly, accessing these tools can also help us to restore our balance. So to understand the well-being of a Native child or to help maintain or restore balance, we can ask, what are the holistic interrelationships that contribute to the child being able to thrive? Or what are the strengths as we go around this circle? Conversely, what are the holistic interrelationships that disturb the child's balance? Or what are the gaps or impediments? What's getting in the way? And finally, what factors can come into harmony and allow the child not only to survive, but to thrive? So what are the factors and the balance of those factors? Things like relationships with elders, knowing who you are, having access to your language and culture, having physical exercise and good food that many subsistence activities in our communities provide. So this understanding of well-being that I'm describing is also aligned with my own Kodiak-Alutiiq worldview, wherein we look at balance of the physical, emotional, social, ethical, and cognitive spheres. So with that backdrop, I want to turn now to talk a little bit about the role of traditional culture in child well-being. Encoded in indigenous cultures around the world are critical elements that contribute to the balance and to the health and well-being of children, their families, and their communities. Teachings about the sacredness of children, extended family and kinship relations, and the practice of interdependence and reciprocity. As funders and community partners, you have a key opportunity to support the well-being of Native children and youth, which ultimately contributes to the health and well-being of their families and their larger communities. How children are treated by their caretakers, kin, and community has deep roots in Native culture. Historically, through current times, tribes have had values, customs, and traditions that have kept children safe and have prevented both abuse and neglect. Traditional tribal teachings place children in a revered position. Newborns were gifts from the Creator, and should they be mistreated, the Creator would take them back. Children, being recent from the Creator, know the peace and the love of the Creator's realm, and if they're not nurtured, made welcome, and cared for, they will return to that realm. Parents were advised to sing to their children, to talk to them as wise spirits, and pay respect to them as they came to this world perfect from creation. As children grew, they were taught how to live in this world, how to help and nurture others, and how to be safe in the environment. Collective values and community living meant that no child went hungry unless all were hungry. Extended kinship groups provided for children as units. Aunts and uncles were called mom and dad. Cousins were referred to as brother and sister. And in many Native languages, there were no words for orphan because there was literally no such concept. It would seem in such cultures that children would have never suffered abuse or neglect. However, we know from our traditional stories and legends that child safety was taught, so it must have occasionally been an issue, as it is in all cultures. There are stories that tell of the taboo of incest, of bad things that happen when children are unsupervised, and of the Creator's sadness when people ignore the needs of children. There are also stories that advise parents to keep their children away from people who would harm them, and other stories that advise children to be aware of those who might be unsafe. While traditional cultures fostered safety and prevented abuse and neglect, it also regulated parents' behaviors toward their children. So tribal elders acted as judges. Traditional chiefs or clan leaders governed as the protectors of child well-being. Clans, bands, societies, and kinship systems functioned as service providers and as protectors of positive social norms for parenting and child safety. Child safety was embedded in Native cultures as an essential element for communal survival. Societies that are interdependent simply cannot afford to allow children to be treated badly. The historic teachings about child development are telling in this regard. Children are born totally dependent on adults and older children for their safety, care, and well-being. At this stage, their feet never touch the ground. The well-cared-for child, it is taught, grows up to be a strong provider, a loving parent, and a dependable, well-mannered adult. With many care-providing adults, a child is seldom not in someone's arms or nestled in their cradle board watching the world or sound asleep in the midst of adult activity. A nurturing network of care and a nurturing network of care providers creates multiple reciprocal bonds and attachments. The notion of a single primary bond is a concept that is largely a cultural belief emanating from the norm of nuclear family cultures of the West. Many Westerners have not experienced and do not understand attachment structures in extended kinship cultures, where the infant feels safety in the network of nurturers, because all of the voices, smells, and touches are familiar, safe, and comforting. This stage lasts until children have their baby teeth. Children raised in such a nurturing network tend to be calm, content, and observant. They tend to become part of the nurturing network early and to contribute to the interdependence of the group, as children as young as age 4 or 5 learn to pay their respects to their elders by bringing them food or water. Developmentally, children raised in this manner, becoming independent early, feel the protection of the network to explore, to test their skills, and to wonder why about everything. During the time they have their baby teeth, they're free to explore, to check in, to imitate adults, and to be busy and curious. Teachings say that at this stage, when children become helpers to the nurturing network, their new helping behaviors are rewarded, their new skills are encouraged, and they receive teachings about how to be a good human being. By age 8, 9, or 10, when they have their adult teeth, they're ready to learn about spiritual and cultural practices and ceremony. They learn how to treat one another and how to prepare for the transition from dependency to providership. This transition is the developmental challenge of adolescence. Traditional cultures structured this time with rites of passage, with rituals, essential roles for youth, and respect for experiential learning. Youth were expected to make some mistakes, to be rash, and to take risks until they had developed some wisdom. Late adolescence and early adulthood were structured, and risk-taking behavior was channeled into activities in support of the group. Young people also had significant responsibility for younger siblings and cousins. Learning responsibility was the cornerstone for healthy interdependence, which meant that by the time parenthood came, young people knew how to parent in the nurturing network and continue the felt safety of the next generation. So I'll take a brief moment here to challenge us to think about our current tendency and policy and practice at many levels to privilege evidence-based practice and gold star randomized control trials as the best way of knowing what interventions will be most effective for all children and families. Considering community-based definitions of success, being open to a variety of evidence and ways of knowing, and seeking to balance scientific and cultural rigor will go a long ways towards building an evidence base that will serve the needs of all of the diverse families and children in the United States. The healthy traditional Native teachings and practices that I've been describing were disrupted when nurturing networks were dismantled and that children dependent on them became vulnerable to disease, starvation, killing, forced relocation to boarding schools, placement with non-Native nuclear families, and other traumas that were perpetrated during the settler colonial period. These assaults, coupled with cultural genocide or outlawing Native spirituality, ceremony, and language, while fostering deeply held prejudices and racism, were designed to extinguish the way of life that I just described. So let's talk about the history of federal Indian policy. At NICWA, we say the recipe for colonization is the same for Indigenous peoples around the world. In every case, the colonizers must accomplish 5 things. First, to take the land. Second, to control the natural resources, especially water. Third, to usurp Indigenous governance. Fourth, to delegitimize Indigenous thought and ways of knowing. And fifth, and most important, to take the children. Break the transmission of culture from parent to child. Prevent the nurturance and socialization that allow the worldview, the values, and the cultural practices to be passed on to the next generation. Take away their identity, their knowledge of who they are and who they are connected to, their sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves. It is important to understand that there were very intentional federal policies enacted over several hundred years, some as recently as the 1970s in my lifetime, that brought together the ingredients in this recipe and that continue to hold them in place. Taking the land occurred through forced marches to newly designated territories. Allotment of native lands to native people with surplus lands, often the most highly desirable land, meted out to non-natives, and the establishment of the reservation system. These policies were also the way that natural resources were commandeered, timber and other building materials, animals and plants for food. Water was literally rerouted through the construction of dams. Tribal nations' ability to govern themselves was supplanted by federal policies. Traditional forms of governance by which Native people governed themselves effectively for thousands of years were replaced with dominant control over subjugated Native peoples, sometimes accompanied by a token form of Native community governance. Treaties, the Federal Major Crimes Act, the General Allotment Act, and even the Indian Reorganization Act are examples of policies that impeded tribes' ability to govern themselves. Indigenous thought and ways of knowing were delegitimized. The wisdom about astronomy, agriculture, subsistence hunting and fishing, wildfire management, architecture, medicine and healing, education, and raising healthy children, all of these things that were encoded in traditional cultures and practices were labeled as backwards, savage, outdated, or simply useless. At the same time as they were suffering significant trauma, Native religions and healing practices were outlawed as policies literally prevented Native people from gathering together in groups. And young children as young as 3 were forcibly removed from their families and communities to stop the socialization of children into their own Native identity, worldview, values, and culture, to disconnect them from their sense of belonging and connection to something bigger. The scale of this assimilation policy is staggering. While there was not good record keeping and many records have been lost or housed in myriad government, church, and private holdings, we do know a few data points. In 1926, just less than 100 years ago, almost 83% of school-aged Native children were in a boarding school, 83%. Between 1819 and 1969, Native children as young as 3 years old went to more than 408 federal Indian boarding schools in 37 states, and those are just the ones we know about. There are likely many more. About 50% of these schools received support from religious institutions or organizations, including funding, personnel, and infrastructure. 14 different religious denominations operated boarding schools. Based on a military model of education and socialization, Native children were separated from their families by hundreds or even thousands of miles. They were brought to barracks where their hair was cut, and they were required to wear military-style uniforms. Children were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their traditional ways. Punishment was often severe. As evidenced by some known boarding school cemeteries, thousands of children died in boarding schools or running away to return to their families. Philanthropy and the nonprofit sector are uniquely oriented toward the well-being of people and communities and the collective good of society. Yet our organizations were part of the scaffolding and infrastructure of boarding schools that at times voluntarily and most often coercively removed or even stole Native children from their families. This is a painful and pointed reminder that nonprofits' desire to do good does not inoculate us from the racism and bias that enables us to do significant harm, both historically and today. Native children were intentionally the targets of many assimilation efforts. As it proved difficult to assimilate adults, separating children from their parents was the most effective means of stripping children of their culture and identity. And this process was insidious. It started in one system, but was powerfully replicated and transferred across systems. As evidence of the harm of boarding schools grew and their popularity waned in the 1960s, the public child welfare system took over where they left off. Public and private child welfare agencies perpetuated this removal, taking children even further away from their families and communities through efforts like the Indian Adoption Project, a public-private partnership between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Child Welfare League of America. I'm going to pause here and show you 6 minutes of a larger clip of video that makes this point about how Native child removal is replicated and perpetuated across systems in a powerful way, furthering the transmission of intergenerational trauma. So we're going to watch just 6 minutes of this, but we'll make sure that you have the clip and can watch the full version later.
I was adopted by a white missionary couple.
I was adopted.
Immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years. They were white.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
they took the idea that they were saving me.
Saving us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us. And to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the U.S. found a new solution: to absorb and assimilate them. It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms and basically ran an assimilation experiment. And then he took his results to the federal government and said, they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded.
In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever off-reservation boarding school for Native American children. His motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. What started there at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide, disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair was cut short. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their native languages.
To take our children and to indoctrinate them into Western society, to take away their identity as Indigenous peoples, their tribal identity. I think it's one of the most effective and insidious ways that the U.S. did do harm to Indigenous peoples here, because it targeted our children, our most vulnerable. And they tried to make us ashamed for being Indian, and they tried to make us something other than Indian.
There are also accounts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, of forced manual labor, neglect, starvation, and death.
My great-grandfather went to Carlisle, and nobody in my family ever talked about it. So if you Google Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you will see will be actually from Carlisle. Colonel Pratt created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was working. So it was, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlisle model of education swept the country and led to the creation of over 350 boarding schools to assimilate Native American children.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
In 1900, there were about 20,000 Native American children in these schools. By 1925, that number more than tripled. Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even camped outside to be close to them. Many students ran away. Some found ways to hold on to their languages and cultures. Others, though, could no longer communicate with family members. And some never returned home at all. By stripping the children of their Native American identities, the U.S. government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands, and that was part of the U.S. strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away to boarding schools, a number of U.S. policies infringed on their tribal lands back home. In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away.
The whole thing was purposeful. And the fact that it has been buried in the history books and not acknowledged is also intentional. And in fact, the same tactics were used in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. All of these countries have acknowledged, apologized, or reconciled in some way, except for the United States.
So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the grief and loss, the deep trauma that this recipe for control perpetuated on Native children, on families, on communities, and on people nationwide in the several hundred years of colonization in the United States. I know we have a lot of Indigenous colleagues and partners who are here with us in the room too, and just want to acknowledge that this can be a difficult thing to be processing in this moment, particularly if your family has had personal experiences with boarding schools or with the public child welfare system, like so many of us have. And I want to acknowledge that in Indigenous communities the world over, this 5-ingredient recipe almost worked, almost. But today, in many Native communities, Native people believe that we are the manifestations of the prayers of our ancestors, that our ancestors literally prayed us into being. Colonization failed to assimilate us, although it gravely damaged our capacity to create and sustain safe environments for our children, and directly led to much of the social dysfunction and problems that we see in some Native communities today. Scholars have shown direct links between forced removal from traditional lands, starvation, disease, cultural loss, and forced removal to boarding schools and foster care. Direct links between those things and the post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide, and substance use disorders, among other issues, not only for the Native people who directly experienced these conditions, many of whom are still alive today. This is very recent history, but also for several generations of their direct descendants. So this trauma, as science now shows, something Native people have known for thousands of years, this trauma is passed down in our DNA and in our bodies. This historical trauma, or the collective emotional and psychological injury over the lifespan and across generations, as Lakota psychiatrist Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart explains, is real, and it has contemporary and lasting effects. So the work before us is decolonization, or as my board calls it, re-indigenization, reclaiming the integrity of those nurturing networks for every Native child and family. The teachings of the past and the natural prevention and support systems, though diminished by colonialism and assimilation, continue to facilitate the well-being of children today. Beta Newbreast, a Blackfeet community advocate, says that our work today is remembering, literally, the putting back together of families and communities. So I turn now to my last topic, the way forward, what funders and nonprofits can do now and together. We cannot undo the damage that was done by government policies of assimilation or wash our hands of the nonprofit sector's role in it. We can only work to repair some of the damage that was done by helping to uncover the truth and engage in and support efforts to heal, especially in community-driven efforts. And I feel like I heard a lot about this in the welcome session this morning for you, those of you who are able to be here. So the theme is consistent. As November, National Native American Heritage Month begins, it's my sincere hope that Foundation leaders will play a vocal and passionate role in making this happen. It is true that the support that Native children and their families need most can only be born of coming together with open hearts and minds and the willingness to do things differently, which begins with relationship building and recognizing the wisdom of Native communities to address the challenges they face. I think that invitation is before us. It will be hard and none of us can do it alone, no matter what gifts the Creator has granted us. It takes us all. Another value teaching of Indigenous peoples is the belief in interdependence, that out of necessity, we rely on one another. We Alutiiq people are taught that each human being has different gifts and talents provided by the Creator, all of which the community needs. Community members have the responsibility to contribute their gifts and talents. We're bound together and each person is indispensable. To ensure that these gifts and the natural resources on which our survival depends continue to support our existence, stewardship is essential. We are responsible for ourselves, for other people, and for the environment around us. We cannot afford to discount or ignore the very things that will allow us to exist as humans. So what does all of this mean for our work here among the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative? First, you don't have to be the experts. You don't have to already know how to do this, to fund community and capacity building organizations, to work towards creating the environments that strengthen the well-being of Native children. Don't be paralyzed in taking the first step by the weight of the responsibility and the stakes at hand for generations of Native children. Many people have the gifts, the talents, and the knowledge that you need to help you figure out the pathways, and many of them are here in this room. You can invite them to help you co-create the supports and conditions that Native children need by empowering communities, by asking Native-led nonprofits and community leaders, by asking extended family members, and by asking youth themselves. What will help them thrive and what gets in the way of their health and well-being? Honor their self-determination. Ask communities if you can visit them to meet with leaders and families. You can be the humble learner. You can ask, what is your definition of a thriving Native child? What does it look like in your community? What support do you need to help realize that goal? You can ask, how can we appropriately partner with you? How can we build a durable relationship where we can call out mistakes that inevitably happen when we make them, and where we can learn from one another? What role can our funding and support play in supporting your vision for youth? You can ask families, whom we often blame for their problems, what support or help they need. It doesn't matter if intentions are good. You can't substitute your own judgment about what is in the best interests of Native children. We all bring baggage or preconceived ideas about things to our lives and to our work. Often the cultural lens that we apply, how we judge success or what we think communities or families might need, is invisible to us. Through allyship and having diverse people around the table to address the challenges we face, we can surface our baggage or bias and ultimately come to more responsive, effective, strengths-based solutions. Finally, you have a unique tool and position in this work. I want you to feel your agency. Many of you have explicit missions about the well-being of children. Some of you are even focused on children who are the furthest behind, who are the least well-served. You are attuned to systematic disadvantage and bias in our contemporary systems, including our helping systems. Many of you came to this work through your community-mindedness, your social justice values, or your faith or spirituality. While the work before you to do a better job for Native children and families, to help create the conditions in partnership with communities to produce healthy and well children who become diverse, productive, contributing citizens of Native communities is a heavy lift, you have the opportunity to live up to this call. It is in you. At NICWA, we believe that every Native child must have access to community-based, culturally appropriate services that help them grow up safe, healthy, and spiritually strong. Creator put us here to protect and nurture our children. We have a sacred responsibility, and our children, all of our children, can't afford to wait. Koyana.